It's just before 11 a.m. on a quiet Friday morning in Skidmore, Missouri. July 10th, 1981. Population 440. Main Street is small, familiar. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and everything. A man walks out of a local bar and climbs into a pickup truck. He's tall, around 6 feet, with a solid build. Dark hair, bright blue eyes, by some accounts, even attractive. In the passenger seat sits his wife, Trina McLeod. Smaller, quiet, long dark hair, still. At first, there's nothing really unusual about this scene, until people start showing up. Not one or two, dozens. Some standing in the street, some lingering near the bar, others watching from a distance. No one says anything, but you can feel it. The tension, the weight of it, the kind of silence that isn't empty, it's just waiting. The man behind the wheel looks at the crowd. They're angry. He is too, because as far as he's concerned, they should know better than to cross him. Then, gunshots. Not one or two, several, all coming from different directions, tearing into the truck. The crowd scatters. Some duck, some run, some freeze. Inside the cab, Trina drops down into her seat. The man behind the wheel slumps forward, and just as quickly as it started, it's over. Silence again, until Trina starts screaming. Her husband is dead, shot in broad daylight on Main Street, in front of over 50 witnesses. The police arrive to a street full of people, and when they start asking questions, no one saw anything. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when silence finally takes over. Now, I've said this over the years, and I'll say it again. I really don't like unsolved cases. I hate the endless theories, all the speculation, the way that we go in circles and still end up with nothing. So if you've been listening since 2021, you're probably wondering why I'd even be here right now. And if this story sounds familiar, it should. I covered it years ago. It's one of my favorites. And as we are leading up to episode 100 next week, I wanted to revisit this case with a different lens. Clearer. A better understanding of what this case actually represents. Because it is different. This isn't a mystery where we don't know what happened. It's a case where dozens of people were standing right there when Ken Rex McElroy was murdered. They saw it, they knew who did it, and still no one has ever been arrested. So this episode isn't about guessing. It's really about systemic failure, fear, and what happens when a group of people are just pushed too far. Now, to understand how something like this could happen, we have to talk about where it all started. Skidmore, Missouri. It isn't just a small town, it's isolated. At the time, the population hovered around 440 people. Today, it's closer to half of that. This is a rural farming community where generations of families have lived within a few miles of each other. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, your parents' name, and all of your business. There's really no anonymity. And there's not much in the way of protection either. Law enforcement has always been limited, thinly spread across a massive county, slow to respond, and in some cases, hesitant to get involved. Not because they don't care, but because in a town so small, stepping in can mean putting a target on your back. And that's the part that people don't always get. In a place like Skidmore, the fear doesn't stay contained. It spreads, and it spreads quickly. Reputation matters, power matters, and when the system that's supposed to protect you feels unreliable, people start looking for other ways to feel safe in their homes. And that's where this story really starts. It all cycles around Ken Rex McElroy, a man not born into power. He was born into abject poverty. On June 1st, 1934, in Overland Park, Kansas, the 15th of 16 children. His parents were migrant sharecroppers moving between Kansas and the Ozarks before eventually settling in Skidmore, Missouri. Home was cramped into a 2-bedroom house, packed with people, noise, and not a lot else. By most accounts, McElroy stood out physically. He had dark hair, bright blue eyes, and that's pretty much where all the positives end when discussing this man's childhood. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, just 15 years old. Around that time, he also suffered a serious head injury after he fell out of a hay wagon. Bad enough that doctors implanted a steel plate in his skull, something that gets mentioned a lot in discussions about him, but it doesn't fully explain what happened next. Because by 15, the pattern had already started. If we're fair, he'd already become known by the police by the age of 13. And not in a passing way, in a we pick this kid up often kind of way. It started with him just bullying other kids, specifically kids from families who were doing better financially than his. He would take lunch money, intimidate people, steal things from their book bags or their lockers, but it didn't stay small. As he got older, the crimes escalated. Shoplifting turned into breaking and entering. Stealing from kids turned into stealing from businesses. And next to that, his behavior towards women started raising red flags. He was drinking heavily, chasing women constantly, and harassing anyone he found attractive, whether they were interested or not. Now, most kids eventually hit a space where consequences force them to stop this kind of behavior. McElroy never did. By the time he died, he had racked up over 24 felony charges: assault, arson, cattle rustling, burglary, theft of grain, theft of livestock, repeated allegations of child molestation and statutory rape, but somehow nothing ever stuck. His own attorney once said that Ken averaged 3 criminal cases per year. Every year. And he never spent more than a short stint in county jail. It wasn't that people didn't report him. Nothing ever stuck. And that wasn't luck. It was Ken's strategy. See, Ken McElroy built his life around intimidation. Witnesses would always back out of trials surrounding him. The victims would recant their testimony. People who considered speaking up suddenly had someone sitting outside of their house or calling in the middle of the night or making it very clear that if you testify against Rex, there will be consequences. He didn't just commit crimes, he also controlled the aftermath, and at one point even pulled a gun on a town marshal. And when the other officers refused to step in, afraid of retaliation, the marshal quit. That's the kind of presence that Ken Rex McElroy had in Skidmore. And then there was his lawyer, Richard McFadden, a very skilled defense attorney who knew how to work the system. Delays, venue changes, technicalities, whatever it took, he was willing to do it. And McElroy always had the cash to pay him. Because while farmers in the area were struggling, McElroy would show up to bars with pockets full of money, sometimes sitting right next to the man who he'd just stolen from. And no one could ever say a word. And then there's the part of the history that's a little harder to hear, but impossible to ignore. McElroy had a pattern when it came to women. He started young, when they were vulnerable, still girls, usually from poor families. He'd gain their trust, offer them rides, give them small gifts, and then isolate them. At 18 years old, he married a 17-year-old named Oleta, but she wasn't the only one. Over the next decade, he fathered multiple children with different women, many of them underage. He never hid it. At one point, he was married to a 15-year-old while also abusing a 13-year-old that he beat into compliance and then moved her into his home. And this wasn't rumor. Everyone in town knew. These girls' families knew. Law enforcement knew. But nothing stopped him. By the early 70s, McElroy wasn't just a criminal. He was a constant presence. A man who would steal from you, threaten you, hurt you, and walk free every single time. For this case, the point of Rex's abuse centers around one girl. Trina McLeod was 14 when she became entangled in Ken McElroy's world. By that point, he already had his pattern. He wasn't just dating the young girls. He would groom them, move them into his orbit, away from their family, away from all stability, away from anyone who would intervene. And when Trina became pregnant as a teenager, that pattern locked into place completely. She dropped out of school and moved in with Rex and another young woman in his household. Neither of them were there by choice. At one point, they actually both tried to escape and ran to family for help, but McElroy found them. And at gunpoint, he forced both girls back into his car. What followed wasn't just violence. It was escalation with no limits. He beat one of the women severely. He forced Trina into sexual acts. Then he took her back to her own family home, killed her dog in front of her and her family, and burned her parents' house down as they watched. That wasn't just punishment, though. This was a message, a reminder of what would happen if you tried to leave. But Trina was stronger, probably stronger than most people realized. She tried again just 2 days later. This time, she used a medical appointment as a cover to escape. At the doctor's office, she was visibly distressed, and the staff immediately recognized that something was wrong and contacted authorities. Social services intervened. Her baby was placed in foster care. Trina got hospitalized for her own safety and mental health issues. And for a moment, it looked like the system was going to actually do something. And then in June of 1973, McElroy was indicted on charges of arson, assault, and rape. He was arrested, arraigned, and then released on $2,500 bond. Within days, he walked back into his attorney's office with $15,000 in cash. His defense was already structured: delay the case, break things apart, wear the system down. And it worked. Meanwhile, Trina was in foster care, supposedly protected, but Ken found her anyway. He began showing up outside of the home where she was staying, sitting in his car for hours, watching, waiting, just close enough to be legal, but distant enough that he was still untouchable. When the police were called, they would tell him to leave, and he would. Briefly. Then he would start making phone calls, threats, constant surveillance, psychological pressure that followed Trina into every part of her life. She was terrified of ringing phones, of strangers, of silence. And at one point, McElroy called the foster family directly and said, "I know where your daughter goes to school, and she can be taken care of." That's when the case expanded. Prosecutors actually added additional felony charges after interviewing Trina and learning the extent of the abuse that she had endured for years. That should have been the turning point, but it became another delay. McElroy's attorney split the charges into separate trials. Dates were set, postponed, reset again. The process stretched on for years, bleeding momentum out of a case until it didn't have any urgency anymore. Eventually, Trina got moved again, this time to live with her grandmother. And that's when everything fell apart. In rapid succession, McElroy's wife filed for divorce, and then almost immediately, he reappeared asking for Trina's hand in marriage. Her mother signed the paperwork, exhausted after the years of being worn down. A judge married them the next day. And just like that, McElroy's defense lawyer made the final move. He informed the prosecutor that Trina, now his legal wife, could no longer be compelled to testify. And just like that, the central witness to the case was gone. It could have been challenged. This could have been something that was fought, but it wasn't. Everyone was just so tired. And they really understood the same truth. Even when the system had McElroy, it still let him go. For a brief stretch, things in Skidmore go quiet, but the silence is short-lived. On July 27, 1976, Ken McElroy crossed a line he had never crossed before, at least not publicly. Romaine Henry was working on his farm when McElroy arrived uninvited. He fired a shotgun into the air, claiming Henry had been on his property earlier in a white Pontiac. Henry was confused. He didn't know what Ken was talking about, and he told him plainly, "I don't even have a white Pontiac." That's when McElroy shot him, once in the stomach, and then again as Henry tried to get into his truck. The second blast hit him in the face. Henry survived only because the shotgun jammed after the second shot. His wife drove him to a nearby hospital, and McElroy was arrested the next day on charges of assault with intent to kill. But from the beginning, he denied even being there. And then the system did exactly what it did before. Delays, venue changes, procedural resets. McElroy walked right back into his attorney's office, and McFadden was already working it, just like all the other trials. But something changed. This time, McElroy didn't just rely on the courtroom. He returned to Henry's farm over and over again, over 100 separate visits between the shooting and the trial, sitting, watching, waiting. Henry reported him over and over again, but nothing happened. And that's the moment the town really understood something. Reporting McElroy doesn't protect you. It exposes you. When the trial finally started, the prosecution was inexperienced and completely outmatched. The state presented witnesses who placed McElroy at the scene, but the defense countered with conflicting testimony, including men who claimed he was elsewhere entirely, out hunting with them miles away. The jury ultimately returned a full acquittal. No assault, no attempted murder, no consequences. And McElroy didn't just walk free. He made sure people knew it. He bragged openly that he might as well have killed Henry and gotten away with it. A few months later, Henry was back on his tractor when he got shot again, this time with a rifle. There were no witnesses, no arrest, no trial. He survived again, but he didn't return to the same life afterward. And in Skidmore, a message had been delivered that everyone understood without anyone having to say it. The first time you report Ken McElroy, nothing happens. The second time, it'll be worse for you. By 1980, Skidmore wasn't just tense. The town was waiting. Everyone knew something bad was going to happen eventually. The only question was when and who it would happen to. And it started almost absurdly with a 10-cent piece of candy. On April 25th, children from the Ken McElroy family walked into a local grocery store. There was confusion at the register, multiple kids, lots of different payments, a small mistake. One child left without paying for one piece of candy. The clerk called after her. And that's when things escalated. One of the older children came back, furious, threw the candy down, stormed out. Another sibling followed, yelling that no one was going to accuse them of stealing. The store owners were Lois and Bo Bowenkamp, new residents to the town, trying to run a quiet business in a town that didn't feel all that quiet anymore. Bo was almost 70. Lois was in her late 40s. They tried to calm the situation down. They didn't stand a chance. And within minutes, the tension boiled over. Bo told the family they were no longer welcome in the store. And that really should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. About 20 minutes later, Ken Rex McElroy arrived in his truck carrying a knife, and right behind him was Trina McLeod, shouting threats at Lois. Bo tried again to de-escalate. He explained it was just a misunderstanding. No one was being accused of theft in any serious way. For a moment, it almost worked. And then Ken demanded free cigarettes. And that's when he was told by Bo Bowenkamp that his family were no longer welcome in the store. Ken left, but he stayed outside for hours, just watching. Later that night, he followed the Bowenkamps home and circled their property over and over again. They called the sheriff, who told them to ignore it. That's just Ken being Ken. At one point, McElroy even offered Lois $100 if he would physically fight Trina, and whatever happened would settle what was between them. Lois refused. The next day, Ken returned again, this time with Trina, waited outside their home. When police were called, they left before they arrived, helped by a police scanner he had in his truck. And again, officers said there was nothing they could do as long as Ken stayed off of their property. But it escalated. About 1 month later, McElroy and Trina parked outside the Bowenkamp property. Lois watched from inside as McElroy walked the perimeter with a shotgun. He fired it into the air, left, came back, fired again. She reported it, but no report was even filed. No follow-up was made by police. No interventions came. And on June 8th, 1980, Bo Bowenkamp was working late at his store. when Ken McElroy arrived again. This time, though, it wasn't a threat. He shot him. A young boy found Bo collapsed inside of the store and called for help. And when police arrived, they asked him, "Who did this?" And Bo answered immediately, "Ken McElroy." McElroy was arrested hours later. He denied everything as usual, called his lawyer, posted bond. He was released. That night, he and Trina were seen at a local bar celebrating. Bo survived, but just barely. And when he returned home, the intimidation didn't stop. It escalated. Anyone who visited Bo was threatened. A minister came to offer support and received warning calls. Not only were the Bowen camps being threatened, but they were being isolated from friends, family, and any kind of comfort. Lois began writing to state officials begging for help. "Are we to live in fear for the rest of our lives?" she asked them. And yet, despite a shooting, a named attacker, and a town all watching this unfold, Ken McElroy was still free. He started telling people in bars that Bo had actually come at him first with the knife that he used while cutting boxes, that he'd been forced to act in self-defense. But the story didn't really hold up, not to the people who knew the timeline. But Ken wasn't really trying to convince everyone. He was reinforcing something, subtly. The rules don't apply to me. Then came the moment that made law enforcement uneasy. McElroy walked up to the part-time town marshal, David Dunbar, and asked him, "Are you planning to testify against me?" And Dunbar said, "I might have to." And McElroy responded, "I'll kill anyone who tries to put me in jail." Then he pulled a shotgun from out of his truck and pointed it at the marshal. That should have been the moment where everything changed. But instead, Dunbar simply calmed him down, de-escalated, and called it in. The response from the authorities was routine and almost comical. "Don't provoke McElroy, just keep an eye on him." By Monday morning, Dunbar turned in his badge. He had a family, and he understood the direction that this was going. If the system wasn't going to back him up, he was not going to be the only one left standing in front of McElroy alone. Later, he would learn that McElroy had also harassed the state officer who arrested him, including drive-by intimidation attempts aimed at the officer's wife while the officer was on duty. There was no boundary this guy wasn't willing to cross. Meanwhile, his attorney, McFadden, continued doing what he always did, moving the case, delaying things, breaking things apart until it barely resembled urgency anymore. The trial got moved 75 miles away to Bethany, Missouri. And in June of 1981, it finally began. The prosecutor was young, only a couple years out of law school, but presented a very straightforward case. Witnesses placed McElroy at the scene of the shooting. The evidence was clear enough, even if the system wasn't. The defense countered with the familiar tactics. Witnesses brought in from McElroy's circle, claiming he was elsewhere, men who waited nearly 9 months to come forward with their version of events. They couldn't explain the delay, but it didn't matter. The jury deliberated quickly, and for the first time in McElroy's life, he was convicted. Assault, second degree, 2 to 4 years recommended. Ken Rex McElroy had just been convicted of assault in connection with the shooting of Bo Bowenkamp. For the first time in his 47 years, someone had found him guilty of something. But in Skidmore, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like this was just a delay, because nothing even changed about McElroy's behavior after the conviction. If anything, it made him worse. He posted bail immediately, and within days, he was back in Skidmore. 4 days after his conviction, he walked into a local bar carrying an M1 rifle with a sharpened bayonet. He told people in the bar he was looking to sell it, but he couldn't resist talking trash. Sitting there openly, he described how he planned to kill Bo Bowenkamp in detail in front of witnesses with Trina sitting beside him. One man in the bar, retired farmer Pete Ward, walked out immediately. He gathered other people. They documented what they all heard, signed statements, went to the authorities. They revoked his bail. It should have been urgent. A convicted man openly threatening to kill the person he had tried to kill before, sitting armed in public. The judge set the hearing to discuss the bail revocation for 5 days later. Even that wasn't the breaking point. Not yet. Because the town was preparing. People were organizing. They were going to travel to court. Watching, waiting, hoping the system would finally do something. Then came another delay. The trial was pushed 10 more days. McFadden had a scheduling conflict. And in that gap, everything shifted. People decided to gather in the Legion Hall to coordinate travel, to talk, to figure out what came next. What they didn't know yet was the next chapter wasn't going to be decided in a courtroom. It would happen on Main Street. And the question really wasn't if something would happen. This was just a when kind of thing. By the morning of the final confrontation, about 60 people gathered at the local Legion Hall. It started the way these things often do in small towns. Quiet frustration spills into conversation. People comparing stories, shaking their heads, asking the same question they've been asking for years. How is this still happening? But this time things felt different. There was talk of finally bringing in outside help. Someone suggested reaching out to the sheriff from nearby Maryville. Someone believed that he might actually listen. The idea wasn't revenge or violence. They were actually talking about protection, structure, anything that felt like a control in a situation where they didn't have any. According to Sheriff Danny Estes, the conversation that morning even turned toward forming an informal town watch. People asked if they were legally allowed to patrol each other's homes and farms. This wasn't to confront anyone, but they just wanted to feel safe again. Because by then, safety in Skidmore was theoretical. And while the group sat trying to figure out what they were allowed to do, they were about to discover that the question had already stopped being about what was allowable at all. About an hour later, the idea of a town watch stopped mattering entirely. What happened next has never been confirmed in full. It's been reconstructed through witness statements, law enforcement reports, and the silence that followed. But somehow, Ken heard the town was talking about him again that morning. And true to pattern, he came into Skidmore anyway. Just before 11 a.m., he pulled his brand new Chevy Silverado onto Main Street, parked in plain view. No hiding, not cautious in the slightest. It was like he always wanted to be, seen. He wanted the reminder that it didn't matter if he had been convicted. He was still moving freely through a town that had spent years trying to stop him. He and his wife, Trina McLeod, walked into the same bar they always went to. He ordered a beer, Camel cigarettes, Rolaids, ordinary motions, familiar habits, almost casual. As the Legion Hall meeting broke up, people filtered out onto Main Street and saw his truck was there. Word spread fast through the crowd. By the time that Sheriff Estes left for his office in Nottoway County, 15 miles away, the crowd had shifted. They weren't scattering. They were converging. Roughly 30 people stayed outside the bar. Another 30 went inside. No one announced anything. This wasn't coordinated. It just happened. A presence? A pressure? People all standing still, watching the door, watching the windows, watching the man inside who defined their fear for years. And Ken noticed it. Witnesses later said the atmosphere changed. The conversation stopped. The room got tighter. After a while, Ken got up, paid, and bought a six-pack to go. He walked outside, but the crowd didn't move. 45 people stood on or near the street now. Close enough to see, close enough that everyone knew what was happening even if nobody said it. Trina got into the passenger seat first. McElroy got behind the wheel. He paused for a moment, long enough that several witnesses described it the same way. Not rushed and not panicked. It was deliberate, like he was aware of being observed and he wanted to acknowledge it without speaking. He reached for a cigarette. Someone said he even started to light it, but he never finished. The shots rang out, first from the left, then several more from different directions. The sound didn't come as one moment. It came as pieces breaking apart in real time. People dropped. People ran. Others froze. Trina's screams cut through everything as she was pulled from the passenger side, covered in her husband's blood. Then chaos, distance, then nothing. By the time Sheriff Estes heard the call over the radio, he was already miles away. He turned his car around immediately and drove back toward Skidmore, and when he arrived, Ken was sitting dead in the driver's seat of his Silverado, bullet holes marking the truck like evidence of something that had already finished happening. After the shooting, Skidmore didn't erupt, it went quiet. There were dozens of witnesses. People on the street, people outside the bar, people close enough to see everything unfold in real time. And yet, as law enforcement began asking questions, the story started to dissolve. No one saw anything. Or at least they wouldn't say they did. The first round of interviews made it clear almost immediately. There was going to be no cooperation. There was no hesitation, no confusion, just silence. The state stepped in. Then federal agencies, a task force of 23 officers from 6 different law enforcement agencies was assembled to sort through what happened in a town full of eyewitnesses. They brought in the men who had been standing closest to the car. They interviewed the witnesses one by one. They set up a tip line, but nothing came in. No statements, no leads, and no names. Missouri Sheriff Gary Howard later summarized it quite simply. We had 35 leads, and 35 leads said nothing and heard nothing. And the investigation stalled, not because there were no witnesses, but because none of them were willing to become one. On July 20th, Ken Rex McElroy was buried in St. Joseph, a deliberate decision to keep him out of Skidmore soil. That same day, all evidence was handed to a county prosecutor. Witness statements, autopsy findings, sheriff's testimony from the Legion Hall meeting, everything that should have been able to build a case. And the grand jury heard it the next day. Trina McLeod testified, so did the law enforcement, so did townspeople who had been standing feet away from the truck. But there was no indictment. The conclusion was blunt. McElroy had been killed by bullets fired by a person or persons unknown. No arrests, no charges, no names. Sort of a delicious irony. 3 weeks later, a state grand jury tried again. 15 meetings, 5 weeks of testimony. They heard from witnesses, from officers, from survivors of McElroy's violence. They even revisited conflicting accounts involving a man named Del Clement, whose name had surfaced in Trina's statement. Some forensic evidence suggested proximity, but most witnesses contradicted Del Clement being anywhere near. The jury ultimately refused to indict. Then it went to a federal level. The Department of Justice opened an FBI investigation. Agents interviewed the same witnesses. In winter, then again in spring. The answers never changed. I didn't see anything. A federal grand jury followed. Same testimony, same outcome. No one was ever charged, and by the fall of 1982, the prosecutor closed it formally. There's not enough evidence with which to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that was the end of the criminal case. Not with resolution, but exhaustion. In 1984, McElroy's widow filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Nottoway County. The sheriff, the mayor, and every other person they thought they could connect to the day. It settled for $17,600 across all defendants. No admission of guilt, just the quiet logic of cost versus time. Years later, in 2001, Del Clement would dismiss renewed attention with blunt finality. Everything I ever said about it has been said before. Inside Nottoway County, most people eventually settled into the same pattern: avoidance. Not really denial, not confession, just attempting distance away from the situation. Even today, there is no agreed upon version of who fired what shot. Only theories, only fragments. Some residents rejected the idea of vigilante justice entirely, insisting no one at the Legion Hall had ever discussed anything violent, only protection. Sheriff Estes himself maintained that version for many decades. The outside observers rarely describe it that way, though. They call this unresolved, a silence that survived every investigation. Life after Skidmore split in predictable ways. Trina McLeod remarried and left Missouri. McElroy's children scattered across the country. Most of the people involved aged into retirement, carrying versions of the story they were willing to repeat, or some refusing to repeat it at all. Bo Bowenkamp died a decade later. Lois eventually served on the town council. Romaine Henry lived until 2012. When asked about McElroy years later, Lois Bowenkamp didn't hesitate. Her answer stayed consistent. The town is well rid of him. Justice is served. But even Lois's words added something more complicated beneath it. Things should have never reached the point where someone had to deal with Ken Rex McElroy on their own. And Skidmore never really returned to what it was. The population shrank, attention faded, the story remained. To outsiders, it was a true crime case, a mystery, a moral debate. To the people who stayed, it was something else entirely. A memory that everyone agreed not to fully look into. A town that couldn't stop one man, and then couldn't explain how he died. So where does this leave us? Because this isn't really a case you can neatly close. There's no final confession, no verified shooter, no clean answer that ties everything together with a bow. What happened in Skidmore forces you into uncomfortable questions. Was this justice? Was it what happens when justice fails for too long? Was it inevitable that a man like Ken Rex McElroy would eventually meet a moment like this, when fear, frustration, and exhaustion all occupy the same small stretch of road? And more importantly, what does it say about a place when the system designed to protect it becomes something that you can't trust? Because the law didn't just fail to stop McElroy. In the eyes of the people who live there, it failed to stop anything. And when that happens, communities don't stop having standards. They just start enforcing them from somewhere else. Silently, collectively, without ever agreeing to say it out loud. And that's what sticks with you, right? It's not just the violence, but the coordination of silence that followed. Dozens of witnesses, multiple investigations, state, federal, and still no one could or would explain what happened. There wasn't a lack of truth, just a refusal to carry it forward. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, because if you follow this story for long enough, you realize something strange. The truth didn't really disappear, it split. Every time someone was asked to speak, it fractured again. More versions, more distance, less clarity. Almost like the truth itself stopped being one thing and became something that only existed in places no one was willing to hold it. The truth always leaves a trail, but in Skidmore, it didn't lead to answers. It led to more trails and less truth. So maybe the real question isn't who pulled the trigger. Maybe it's what had to break in order for a town full of people to decide that silence was safer than certainty. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. And next week's episode is episode 100.